Hey y'all, welcome to the Liberationist Lit podcast where the power of storytelling meets the force of social change. My name is Taylor, and I have the immense pleasure to be speaking with author Daria Burke about her new memoir of my own making. So, hey, Daria.
Hi, I love that you still have the galley copy. I just saw you when you held it up. I was like, oh my God, she's got an OG copy.
Oh, yes. And I had to get my cutesy little like coffee shop pic with it too. So when the episode goes live, I'll post that as
What?
well.
Well,
So,
thank you so much.
yes. So, Daria, can you kick us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your work empowering women and what led you to tell your story through Of My Own Making?
Yeah, thank you for that. Gosh, I'm gonna maybe try to do it all at once. I think because of my own making as a memoir, it's very much about my own life and experience growing up in Detroit in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of the childhood trauma that I experienced growing up, and I would say being parented by addiction and mental illness. And so much of, I think, the work that I have done in my career, particularly when it's centered around girls and women, and I would say empowerment, but also just being a possibility model, I think hopefully being now, especially that the book has been released, an enlightened witness to their own experiences. I think so much of our healing lies in being seen and just being witnessed. And certainly there's often the career element and my own journey of going to college at the University of Michigan and then pursuing my MBA at NYU and launching into a 20-year career in beauty and in fashion that led me to the C-suite as a chief marketing officer. That plays a role certainly in a lot of the work that I do. But I think about possibility strategy, possibility work, really being this sort of wisdom work. How can we take all the experiences that we've had, and while we're not defined by them, while we should not root our identities in those experiences, how can you create a life or reimagine a life untethered from those things and take what you learn from those things and transmute that into something useful in this life. And so that's a little bit about me and about the book and about the work. I think all in one. The book really at its core is about how we choose who we become. I think it's really important work for us all to be able to distinguish the facts of our lives versus the stories we tell ourselves about those facts. Those stories are just interpretations of the facts. And I think if we're not careful, we can allow those stories to really run the narrative going forward. And so much of this book is about my own experience with what could have been that and some of the ways in which I recreated those early experiences in my own healing journey, and really about the science of healing and the promise that what we learn, we can unlearn, and that we can sort of rewire our brains, our bodies, our beliefs for growth and for healing.
And that's exactly what I loved about your book. You talk a lot about how we are nurtured by the effects of our nature and the science behind trauma, how it affects our brains and how it rewires us but doesn't have to define us. What made you decide to frame your story in this way?
I mean, so much of the book is really me metabolizing everything that I went through and learned. And so, I think there's something to be said about the way in which writing can create some space and some distance for us to allow us to really be sure, have clarity on the perspective that we have or the relationship that we wanna have with the events of our lives. And so it's sort of a combination of things. I think one was me making sense of it for myself and putting it into perspective and then being able to look at it and go, "Yeah, that is how I feel about it right now." And how might the journey of excavating some of those stories continue to change me? You know, how does the relationship that I have with those experiences, how does that look now? How do I want that to look? But then also very much married with the science of healing that I learned in that journey, right? Learning about neuroplasticity, learning about epigenetics, learning about post-traumatic growth, and having these sort of revelatory moments of like, "Oh, this explains how someone could come from such a painful, chaotic, neglectful, abusive past, you know, early, early years, and through radical acceptance, through sitting with and to some degree, bringing some of those things a little bit the hardest things we've ever been through, like, how can you bring them closer enough to look at them and then be able to reimagine the story that you tell yourself about yourself at the same time?" And so I think it's really easy to see someone as an after, right? There's the before that we don't see, and then there's the after, which often can look very polished, very finished, very sort of produced in a way. And I think in a lot of cases with me, people I think are often reacting to my presence more than my presentation. But I think that those things can get conflated. And so when you see someone who's sort of the presentation is such that it seems like such a departure from where they started, they're like, "Well, how did you do that? How did that happen? How did you know to make those choices?" You know, in some ways, the book is me trying to answer that, but also to say that this, like, it's a practice every day. Like, it's an ongoing practice, and so I wanted kind of that mix of science and story because while I do believe that narratives and stories are so powerful in helping us connect the dots in our own lives, it felt important to me to offer a little bit of the how it happened, the why it can happen, and to use that to seed possibility for other people. Like, I think that growth and healing and post-traumatic growth are possibilities for everyone. Will everyone experience them and go through them? No, maybe not, but I believe deeply in the possibility that it can exist for everyone, and so I wanted to try to also offer what I learned while marrying that with my own story to show kind of the science and the soul work of it all.
And I love how you talked about people seeing that finished, polished project, and that is the work you do internally. And I've experienced that myself. One of my friends recently was telling me, "Oh my gosh, you're always so vulnerable and wear your heart in your sleeve, and you're just not afraid to do the hard work." And I have been reflecting that my vulnerability is still sometimes me intellectualizing my feelings as a way to not project the messiness. So I there are a few people in my life who see the fall apart parts. They always see me as like, yeah, nothing's perfect, but here I am with a smile on my face and able to talk about it. And that can be really hard work. And they don't see the care you had to take care of yourself while doing this hard work. They kind of just see after you intellectualized and processed and then can be vulnerable. And so I love to ask people, how do you take care of yourself doing this work and being so vulnerable publicly while being a complex PTSD survivor?
Thank you. First I want to say, and I guess this sort of gets to your question, but also acknowledging that It's it has to be more than intellectualizing it. I think feeling your feelings really matters. And sometimes feeling your feelings looks like allowing emotions to well up, whether it's tears or even fear or anxiety, allowing yourself to feel that and acknowledge that. I don't think that if we don't have full awareness of what's happening in our body, then I don't think you're actually in touch with what you're going through. So, I do think that for me, and it sounds like for you too, intellectualizing it is part of the process. But that's step 1, and so naming it for me is just step 1, and then really feeling it is where the work starts, and because that can look like what's happening in your gut. That could look like the ways in which chronic stress is showing up in your body. So, taking care of myself looks a lot like that. I think so much of my history, I spent so many years running away from my childhood and running away from what I thought would kill me. It's like if I feel my feelings, I won't survive them, and learning that I could, and then figuring out, okay, well, what do I do with them now that I'm staring them in the face? And so I think the presentation of sort of looking cared for definitely was both a reaction to not being cared for, a reaction to the neglect that we experienced as kids, and kind of a survival strategy, both in that it quieted some of the questions from other people, right? When I looked cared for, people didn't ask questions, and so that I could sort of hide behind that in a way that was safe, because the fear was that if people knew what our home situation was like, then we would be taken away. But it was also an act of self-care too. So the ritual and the routine of taking care of myself physically, while I think it's easy to label that as a performance of safety, it was an act of performing care for myself too. So I also find it hard to really kind of divorce those 2 things. And so that's still part of how I take care of myself, like caring for myself, getting up every day and doing the things that a human being does when they're showing care for and respect for themselves, for their well-being, for their health, right? I'm talking basic stuff. I get up, I make my bed every day. I have always been this person. You tend to the daily events of adulting, because part of being cared for is not neglecting those things. Right? And then you can layer on all the other things that I do, like the journaling and the meditation and the walks to the beach and the working out and the talking to friends, right? All of which are also very much in my daily toolbox. But it starts with just showing up and having enough, I think enough belief that I'm good enough to deserve good things. And that starts with taking care of myself and how I treat myself. And so that's what care looks like. And it's on such of a long continuum. I think sometimes we want care to be this one thing that we do. And it doesn't, like I said, healing is a practice. I think self-care in the ways that we're talking about it, not spa days and getting my nails done and, all the consumerist manifestations of self-care that are really just interventions after it's too late because you feel like you don't know what else to do. But the actual act of just being a human being that requires being cared for, that's daily work. And I will just quickly, because I think that positivity piece is so easy to look at it as toxic or again performative. Like, you seem great. And number one, not everybody needs a front row seat to the messy middle. I'm not a messy middle sharer for with most people, 'cause and most people don't need that proximity, right? I have a container for it, and I have the people in my life who I share that with. I'm really okay with that. I think that part of choosing to take care of myself, at least for me, I won't speak for everyone, but it's a conscious intervention. to disrupt despair. There are plenty of things to be sad about, anxious about, scared of. And I don't not let myself acknowledge that too, but it's a conscious effort. It's a conscious practice, a conscious intervention to disrupt things that could also leave me in a state of despair. And that is what people see. And I'm okay with that being what people see. They're seeing clarity, they're seeing self-awareness, they're seeing intention. And I'm totally fine if that's what, how it sort of shows up, if the presentation of that shows up as maybe something that feels quietly polished.
Because at the end of the day, it is quietly polished, you doing the work. And then
Yeah.
so, like, every when you were describing all of the ways you care for yourself, it just made me think of, like, that's a no-brainer. That's how we show up for other people. When we think about care, we know what to do when our favorite person is having a bad day. We know how to show up for our family and what they need and how to care for other people. But sometimes when we think about caring for ourselves, we make it super complicated. And sometimes too, when we put in extra care for other people and neglect care for ourselves, sometimes that's a way for us to lose ourselves. And so I always ask to people who have a lot going on, who are you outside of the work you do? And I know that's a question that you ask yourself in the book as well.
Yeah, I'm just a human being trying to navigate Earth school, right? Like at my core, I think that's really how I think of myself. I think of myself as someone who is dynamic and mutable. And so just the idea of labeling it, I see it so much as a verb versus a noun, right? So I'm living. I'm creating. I'm trying to be a daily maker of things that feel good and feel nurturing and that I was gonna say feel useful, and I don't know that that's actually true anymore. But I do hope that what I make, that my intention in what I make is of use in a positive way, if there's use to be had. But more than anything, that I can just be in the act of making a life. And yeah, I don't know. I'm sort of resistant to I'm becoming increasingly allergic to language that feels too prescriptive. Of course there are things that I do that have titles. I am an author and I am a speaker and I work with people in different ways, but I'm just a human being in Earth School making a life and trying to do it on a daily basis such that I feel good about the time that I spent doing whatever that thing was.
Yes, it's that living with intention and building life with intention. So I know I just said, who are you outside of the work you do, but what are some of your upcoming projects that you may be excited for?
Yeah, well, the book has only been out for 11 weeks now, so I'm still quite active in the launch of it all. The core sort of wave 1, I guess, of the tour has subsided, so I've been local for the last few weeks, and I'm so grateful for that, but it's picking up again, so I have a number of events that I'm really excited about here in the Hamptons, where I am right now, in East Hampton, and I usually try to be really good about updating folks on the surfaces, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then in Atlanta as well, so a couple of book festivals and signings and things like that. And doing more speaking. One of the wonderful things about writing a book and sharing ideas that you have and the experiences that you have is that people want to hear you talk about them. And I love getting to do that. I love getting to do this. So God willing, that will continue to be how I spend the majority of my time. But I'm very much literally living a life of my own making as I'm promoting this book and being in conversation, pretty much constant conversation about it. Yeah, and, I would be lying if I didn't say that I'm also still thinking about other writing projects and starting to form theses and pitches for, personal essays and other things. The thing about writing a book too is that you often figure out other things that are on your mind that don't make its way in the book, and I there are so many other stories and concepts and ideas that didn't really fit in the scope of the book, but they're still with me, so starting to think about how they take shape in the world, and so TBD on those, but I would say just actively still in a lot of conversations, both in the podcast interview realm and then in person.
But yes, I know you have lots of stories inside of you to still share. So, have there been any stories that other people have written that you've been reading lately that has made an impact on you?
Oh my goodness. Admittedly, I love memoir and I love nonfiction, but I have been in fiction land lately just because I've needed a gear shift. I've sort of needed to like consume stories in a different way. So I'm rereading Wicked. I know it's so funny. I read it many, many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago, I would say. And obviously, so very familiar with the story and then had seen it on Broadway and then the film, et cetera, over the last 20 years. But something about the world building and the ways in which stories that we know really well are reinterpreted, reimagined, reconsidered. I'm really drawn to that energy right now. And so I read James by Percival Everett at the end of last year and then, found myself kind of again moving towards stories that are doing that. So I'm rereading Wicked and I'm always kind of revisiting Black women writers at work by Claudia Tate, which is really a collection of interviews that she's done with our legends, our icons, and it's 20 years old, the body of work, and it was reprinted a number of years ago, and I find myself revisiting that a lot as just a way, I think, of hearing the ancestors in my clearly in my head and keeping them close, and the one voice that I think is I don't wanna say is missing, but the one voice that I wish was prevalent there was bell hooks.
Yes. And I feel like bell hooks kind of gets separated from the Black woman literary canon because she was very academic
Yes,
and
and for age.
everybody's like the fiction.
Yeah, I think her age too. I think there was probably a combination of things. I do because you had a number of women who were academics as well in that work and who were professors and students of all sorts of things. But I think part of it was maybe the timeline that she was on. And there you do have a lot of deep interpersonal and professional relationships with a lot of the authors in the book too. And so maybe that was just not she wasn't as connected at the time of the work was being created. I don't know, I need to think a little bit more about that timeline, but yeah, I've just really been drawn mostly though to stories that are kind of these reimaginings of old stories.
Mhm. I love those too, especially if they've been like gender swapped or like culture swapped. Like I love like reimagining stories.
Yes,
So
there's a book that I wish I could remember the name of. Maybe we'll find it and drop it in the show notes, but that does that with The Great Gatsby, or at least it's looking at it from a Black American lens based in Los Angeles. I think that, the story sort of is actually rooted on the West Coast. So I just recently heard about it and tried to make a quick note, which is why it's not as top of mind in terms of the title and the author, but it's written by a Black woman, and I am curious too about that might be next on the list of stories to dive into. But yeah, I love when we do that because that's part of what the human experience actually is, right? It's us, again, sort of the stories being interpretations of these a set of facts based on our own vantage point and or, our knowledge base or knowledge gap. So yeah, I'm so into it.
And so, my last question for us today is, what advice would you offer listeners who want to make a positive impact in the communities?
Mm, I think I would say define community first and foremost. I think that we are so hyper individualistic, I should say, as a culture in the United States. And I think that that has we've lost the plot on what community actually means. I think sometimes we think about it, capital C community, as in joining big organizations and being part of groups. But even that sometimes I think gets muddled by this idea of networking and, that it has to have purpose other than just learning how to human together, learning how to people together. And so I would say if you don't know your neighbors or if you don't know the local bookstore owner or the baristas who make you coffee and or bag your groceries, like that's a really good place to start. Being in East Hampton full time for the last 2 years and writing the book, it's I've had my house for many years now, but being here full time, I've really gotten that small town living, and so knowing everybody at the libraries nearby and those kinds of things, they matter so much, and it gives you insight into what the community actually needs to thrive. And so and the role that you wanna play in community. But sometimes it's just like, what does that mean to me today? And you don't have to be thinking about it as like a problem that you need to solve either. It's just like, what does it look like to share space with other human beings? What does it look like to sit in the classroom of Earth School together, right, with some other folks? And how might we do that together, and what comes when we do that?
I definitely agree because even if it's not with the goal of like solving a problem, inevitably there is going to be a problem that comes up. And so you already have that trust and that safety net with each other. So if they're like, we don't knock on our neighbors' doors anymore and ask for a cup of sugar. And
Right.
so, like, little things like that, just building trust and connection and like knowing you have somebody to fall back on, but also knowing somebody else knowing that they have you to fall back on. So I
Yeah.
love that so much.
That's right, right? We'll DoorDash some sugar before we cross the street, and I get it, right? The world has sort of been designed for that for us, and so I will say, as somebody who still does not know all of her neighbors, I am a part of an association because of where, my neighborhood, it is sort of contained in that we all belong to the homeowners association or over here. It's optional, but everybody participates, and so there are often a lot of gatherings on the beach, and, we get the food truck dates, we get the minutes from the home association, and it sort of forces you to think about what does it look like to be in community, and just to learn how to be inconvenienced. Right, the inconveniences that come with being, with other people and learning how to do that again. I don't think we know how to be sort of air quote "put out" in a way that just comes with, like, being in contact with other living creatures.
Yes, because we're all part of the ecosystem, as messy as it is.
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. So that would be my advice. Just figure out what community looks like and just get to know the people where you spend the most time to start and kinda go from there.
Oh, I love that. So thank you so much, Daria, for being on the podcast. And where can people keep up with you and the work that you're doing?
Thank you. I'm trying to be good about focus. And so I would say I'm the most active on Instagram. It's where I'm usually the most consistent at Daria Burke. And then dariaburke.com, which is my website, I would say is the other place where I, look to support everything that I'm sharing out. But those are probably the two best places to keep in touch with me.
Awesome. I will link all of that in the show notes as well as where you can get the book. So, again, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And thank you, listeners, for listening. If you have stories that you want to share, want to suggest any topics, or just want to connect, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Liberationist Lit, or visit our website, liberationistlit.com. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a review. And remember, your voice matters. And together, through the lens of stories, we're going to make a difference in the world. Until next time.